The stagecoach rolled into Salvation Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1878, and the dust it kicked up hung in the air long after the wheels had stopped turning. Clara Holloway stepped down from the carriage with her travel trunk in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. The flowers had been bright and full when she picked them 3 weeks ago in a meadow outside St. Louis. Now they were brown at the edges, curled inward, smelling of paper and forgotten promises. She wore a wedding dress, not the gown of a wealthy bride, but a simple white frontier dress with a fitted bodice, a sweetheart neckline trimmed in delicate lace, and a long flowing skirt that had been white once before the journey. Now the hem was the color of cinnamon dust, ground into every fold, and the small pearl buttons running down her back were dulled with grit. The dress had been her grandmother's, kept in a cedar chest for 30 years, waiting for a wedding day that Clara had imagined 1,000 times during the long ride west. Her honey blonde hair had come loose during the journey, falling in soft waves past her shoulders, with small wildflowers still tucked into the curls at her temples, where she had placed them that morning, hoping to look pretty for the man who was supposed to meet her here. Her cornflower blue eyes were wide and uncertain, taking in the strange new world of wooden buildings and squinting townspeople. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the heat. She was 23 years old, soft and full-figured, with the kind of healthy, generous beauty that some men called too much and others called everything. She stood in the middle of the dirt road, clutching her dead flowers against her chest, and waited. Walter Briggs did not come. After 10 minutes, a thin, gray-haired man in a stained apron emerged from the general store across the street. He walked toward her with the slow, careful gait of a man delivering bad news. In his hand was a folded letter sealed with red wax that had been broken and resealed with paste. Miss Holloway. She nodded, unable to speak. Her throat had closed up. My name is Hollis Tucker. I run the store yonder. I am sorry, miss. I truly am. He held out the letter. She took it with fingers that had gone suddenly cold. The wild flowers fell from her other hand into the dust at her feet and lay there like something abandoned. The letter was short. Walter Briggs had died 2 weeks ago in a mining accident, killed when a pocket of methane gas exploded 40 feet below the surface. He had no family. His debts had been settled by selling what little he owned. There was no home waiting for her. There was no husband. There was no future. The man who had written her 17 letters across 5 months, who had promised her a small house with a vegetable garden and 3 sturdy children, had been buried in a pauper's grave under a cross of rough pine. Clara stood in the road and read the letter twice, then a third time. The words refused to settle into meaning. Is there someone I can wire? Hollis asked gently. Someone back in St. Louis who could send for you? She shook her head. She could not go back. She could never go back. There is a boarding house, he said. Mrs. Crowley charges 50 cents a night. Maybe she would let you stay a few nights while you figure out your next step. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, but her lower lip trembled in a way she could not control. Thank you, sir, she whispered. She walked the length of Salvation Creek that afternoon, still in her wedding dress, still carrying her trunk. People stared. A group of men outside the saloon laughed when she passed. A woman with 2 small children pulled her babies close and crossed to the other side of the street. Clara felt the eyes of the town on her back like a hot wind, and she understood with a terrible clarity that she was not welcome here. Mrs. Crowley took one look at her and asked for $2 in advance. Clara had $4.17 in a small purse sewn into the lining of her dress. She handed over 2 of those dollars and was given a narrow room with a single window that looked out onto an alley where stray dogs fought over kitchen scraps. She closed the door behind her, and only then did she allow herself to weep. For 3 days, she tried to find work. She walked into every business in Salvation Creek wearing the only other dress she owned, a faded blue calico she had packed for traveling. She offered to wash dishes, to scrub floors, to mend clothes, to cook. The answer was always the same. The proprietress at the boarding house said she was too soft, not built for hard work. The owner of the laundry said he had 3 girls already and did not need a 4th. The school teacher said the position required a married woman of solid reputation. The minister of the small Methodist church told her kindly but firmly that the church did not employ strangers, and perhaps she should consider returning to whatever family she had left behind. By the 4th day, her money was gone. Mrs. Crowley turned her out at noon, citing a paying guest who would arrive that evening. Clara walked out of the boarding house with her trunk and her wedding dress folded carefully on top of her other belongings, and she sat on a bench outside the general store for a long time, watching the town move around her. A few kind women passing on errands slipped her bits of food: a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a boiled egg, half an apple. They did not stop to talk. They placed the food beside her and walked on quickly, ashamed perhaps to be seen helping. She slept 3 nights on the porch of the grain silo at the edge of town, curled around her trunk, listening to the coyotes calling from the hills. On the morning of the 5th day, Clara made a decision. She would walk to Cheyenne 40 miles north through the mountains. There would be more people there, more opportunities, perhaps a position as a domestic servant in a wealthy household. It was a desperate plan. She had no proper boots, no map, no provisions beyond a heel of stale bread that Hollis Tucker's wife had pressed into her hand that morning with tears in her eyes, the only person in town who had ever spoken her name with kindness. But desperation was an old friend by now. She had been running from desperation for a long time. Her grandmother had died on a Tuesday in February of 1874 in a small house on the outskirts of St. Louis, and the world had changed forever that morning. Maeve O'Sullivan had come over from County Cork as a girl of 17, carrying nothing but a satchel of dried herbs, a leather-bound notebook of remedies passed down from her own grandmother, and a fierce, stubborn faith in the healing properties of the green-growing world. She had worked as a midwife and a healer in the Irish neighborhoods of St. Louis for 40 years, delivering babies, mending wounds, treating fevers when the doctors threw up their hands. She had raised Clara from the age of 6 after Clara's mother died of consumption, and her father drank himself into an early grave. For 17 years, Maeve had taught Clara everything she knew: the names of plants in English and in Gaelic, the proper time to harvest yarrow under the full moon, how to dry mullein leaves in the rafters of a smokehouse so they would keep through winter, how to brew willow bark for fever, plantain for infection, valerian root for sleeplessness, raspberry leaf for a woman in labor. The notebook, with its hundreds of recipes written in 2 languages and 3 generations of handwriting, was the most precious thing Clara owned. When Maeve died, Clara had no one in the world except her father's grown son from a first marriage, a man named Cornelius Pratt. Cornelius was 34 when he took Clara into his home, a tall, thin man with a face pitted from a childhood bout of smallpox and eyes that never seemed to settle on anything for long. He drank. He gambled. He ran a small tannery that lost money every year. His wife had left him in 1872, taking their 2 daughters and disappearing into the eastern states, and he had grown bitter and cruel in the years since. Clara cooked for him, cleaned his house, mended his clothes, endured his moods. In the autumn of 1877, Cornelius came home one night from a poker game in the wrong part of town, smelling of whiskey and something darker, and he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Clara with an expression she had never seen before, calculating, final. "I owe a man named Sutter $800, he said. "I do not have $800. Clara waited. "Sutter owns a house on Chestnut Street," Cornelius continued. "A particular kind of house. He has agreed to take you in payment of the debt. You will go to him on Friday." She did not understand at first. When she did understand, she rose from the table and walked into her small bedroom and locked the door, and she did not come out for the rest of the night. She sat on the edge of her bed with her grandmother's notebook in her lap, and she made a plan. She had 3 weeks until Friday. In a newspaper she found in the parlor, she saw an advertisement. A man named Walter Briggs in Salvation Creek, Wyoming Territory was seeking a wife. "Honest woman," the advertisement said, "capable of cooking, cleaning, and making a home. Will provide passage west." She wrote to him that night, by candlelight, with trembling hands. 5 months of letters. A photograph she could not afford to have taken, but he forgave her for that. A train ticket, a stagecoach ticket, a wedding dress packed carefully in a trunk, along with her grandmother's notebook and her grandmother's pearl earrings and a small gold cross that had belonged to her mother. On a Tuesday in late April of 1878, while Cornelius was at the tannery, she walked out the front door of his house and she did not look back. She had been running ever since. Now, on the 5th morning after arriving in Salvation Creek, she shouldered her trunk and began the long walk toward Cheyenne. She did not yet know that Cornelius had already received the telegram from a passing gambler who recognized her in the street. She did not know that he was already preparing to come for her. She knew only that she was tired, and she was hungry, and she had nowhere left to go but forward. The road out of town climbed gradually into the foothills. By midday, she had walked perhaps 8 miles. By 2 in the afternoon, the soles of her thin city boots had worn through, and she could feel every pebble cutting into the bottoms of her feet. By 3, she was leaving small spots of blood in the dust behind her. The sun was a hammer. She had eaten the last of the stale bread an hour ago. Her water canteen, an old tin cup with a leather strap, was empty. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. Her wedding dress, which she had foolishly worn again that morning because it was the cleanest thing she owned, was soaked through with sweat at the back and stained brown to the knees from the road dust. Around 4 in the afternoon, she stopped seeing things clearly. The mountains in the distance seemed to swim and shift. The road in front of her doubled and tripled. She set her trunk down at the side of the road and tried to keep walking without it, but her legs would not hold her. She fell to her knees in the red dust. She knelt there for a long moment, swaying, trying to remember why she had been walking. Her grandmother's voice came to her from somewhere far away. "Get up, Mo Crowy. Get up and keep going. You have not come this far to die in the dirt." She tried. She pushed herself up onto one foot. Her vision went white at the edges, and then she was falling again, and the red dust rose around her in a slow, soft cloud, and she did not feel the impact when her body hit the ground. She felt only the sun on her face, and the strange peace that comes when struggle becomes too heavy to carry any further. She closed her eyes. She did not know how long she lay there. A minute, an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything. What she felt first was the shadow. A great, cool darkness fell across her face, blocking out the merciless sun, and her closed eyelids registered the sudden dimming of red to gray. She heard the sound of a horse's hooves shifting in the dirt, the creak of saddle leather, the soft snort of an animal that had stopped suddenly. Then a second horse. Then a third. A man's voice, low and rough, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "Lord have mercy, Lord." Another voice, sharper, harder. "Is she dead?" A third voice, younger, full of concern. "She is breathing, just barely." She heard boots hit the ground, one pair, then another. A large hand pressed gently against her forehead. The skin was rough, calloused, hot from the sun, but the touch itself was careful, as though the man was afraid of breaking something. He felt for the pulse at her throat. He bent close to her face, and she could smell him leather and wood smoke and the clean, sharp scent of horse sweat. "She is not dead," he said. "Not yet." Clara opened her eyes. 3 men, 3 giants. The man kneeling beside her was the largest she had ever seen. He must have stood 6 feet 7 inches, when upright, his shoulders impossibly broad, his arms thick with the kind of muscle that came from 20 years of hard physical labor. He wore a dark leather vest open over a chest darkened by sun with no shirt beneath, and the sweat of a long ride glistened on his collarbones. His face was weathered and hard, a strong, square jaw covered in 2 days of dark stubble. His hair was a deep chestnut-brown sun streaked at the temples hanging just past his ears. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of whiskey, held up to firelight amber and gold, and shot through with something terribly tired. The second man stood behind him, still mounted on a chestnut horse, a long rifle resting easy across his thighs. He was nearly identical to the first, the same massive frame, the same chestnut hair, the same amber eyes. But his face was sharper, more watchful, and his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the rocks above the road, the line of cottonwoods along the dry creek bed below. He was a man who had learned somewhere in his life that danger could come from any direction at any moment. The third man was kneeling now on her other side, the youngest. Still tall, still powerfully built, but with a softer cast to his face, a gentleness around the eyes that the older two had lost somewhere along the way. He was opening a canvas water bag and wetting a clean cloth. "Drink this slowly, miss," he said, holding the cloth to her cracked lips and letting a few drops trickle into her mouth. "Slowly. Your stomach will rebel if you take too much at once." The water tasted like life. The first man, the oldest, the one with the whiskey eyes, sat back on his heels and watched her. His expression was not kind. It was not cruel either. It was simply the look of a man who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by any of it. "You cannot die here," he said. His voice was not gentle. It was a statement, a simple, weary fact. "There is no water on this road for 10 miles, and the ground is too hard to dig a grave. You cannot die here. You cannot." She tried to speak. Her voice was a dry whisper. "I am sorry." Something flickered in the man's face. Surprise, perhaps. The beginning of something he had buried a long time ago. The mounted man spoke from above. "Ezra, the light. We have another 4 hours of riding." "I know it, Gideon." The youngest one, still kneeling beside her, looked up at his older brothers. "We cannot leave her here." "We cannot take her with us either," the mounted one said. "Not up the mountain. She will not survive the climb in her condition. and if we put her on a horse, we will not make camp before dark." The oldest man. Ezra stared at her for a long time. She could see him weighing things in his head, calculating, and she could see in his eyes that he had made calculations like this before. About other people, about loved ones, and the calculations had not always come out the way he wanted. He reached into a leather satchel hanging from his saddle and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in waxed paper. "Elias," he said quietly, "the bread." The youngest one, Elias, opened the bundle. Inside was a half loaf of dark bread, hard at the edges, a strip of dried venison, the length of a man's hand, a small wrinkled apple, and a tin of water. It was not much. To Clara, it was an entire harvest. "This is what we have for today," Ezra said. He set the bundle down on the ground beside her near her hand, where she could reach it. "Eat, drink. When you can stand, start walking back towards Salvation Creek. It is closer than Cheyenne. Maybe someone there will help you." He stood. He turned away. He took 2 steps toward his horse. "Why?" Clara whispered. He stopped. He did not turn around. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, his shoulders drawn up tight as though her question had struck him somewhere deep. "My grandmother," he said finally, still not turning, "used to say that when you find a stranger dying in the desert, you give them what you have, because someday you will be the one dying and you will need a stranger to do the same." He climbed onto his horse. The youngest Elias lingered a moment longer beside her, and his amber eyes were soft in a way the older 2 could not manage. "Eat slowly, miss," he said again. "Chew each bite many times. Your body will remember how to use food, but you must give it time." Then he too was on his horse, and the 3 of them turned their animals toward the north, and they rode away up the mountain road without looking back. Clara watched them go. She watched them until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, until the sound of their hooves had faded into the wind, and only then did she pick up the bread. She ate the way Elias had told her to, slowly, each bite chewed many times. She took small sips of water from the tin between bites. The bread was dense and slightly stale, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted in her life. The dried venison was salty and tough, and it brought a flood of saliva to her dry mouth that she had not believed possible. The apple, when she finally bit into it, tasted like autumn and orchards and a life she had almost forgotten. She wept while she ate. She ate everything but 2 small pieces of bread, which she wrapped in the waxed paper and placed inside the front of her dress against her skin, where she would not lose them. When the food was gone, she felt a strange warmth spreading through her body. Not strength exactly, not yet, but the memory of strength, the promise of it. She tried to stand. She made it to her knees. She rested. She tried again. She made it to her feet. She looked back toward Salvation Creek. She looked north where the 3 men had gone. She thought about a lifetime spent running, about Cornelius and the house on Chestnut Street, and the long road west, and the dead man in the pauper's grave whose name she had whispered to herself every night for 5 months. She thought about the kindness of 3 strangers who had given her their own dinner. She thought about the look in the oldest one's eyes when he turned away from her. She did not go back to Salvation Creek. She went north. She followed the hoof prints up the mountain road. She walked until the sun set, and then she walked by the light of a half moon. And when she could walk no further, she crawled off the road into a stand of cedar trees and slept curled in the dry needles like an animal. She woke before dawn and walked again. The third day, she ate the last 2 pieces of bread. The fourth day, she drank from a creek and chewed on bitter wild onions she found growing among the rocks. The fifth day, she came around a bend in the trail at sunrise and saw spread out before her in the high meadow below the largest ranch she had ever seen. A long, low ranch house of dark timber with a wide covered porch, stables and barns and outbuildings, corrals where she could see the dark shapes of horses moving in the early light, fenced pastures running up the slopes, smoke rising from a kitchen chimney in the still, cold air. She stood at the top of the rise and looked down at the place, and she understood that this was the home of the 3 men. This was where they had been riding to. She did not go to the front door. She had learned in the long days of walking that her dignity had been peeled away from her piece by piece, and what remained was something more like an animal seeking shelter. She walked down toward the ranch from the backside through a stand of aspens, and she came upon a milking barn, just as a heavy-footed older woman was crossing the yard with a wooden bucket in each hand. Clara fell forward against the fence. Her legs simply stopped working. She did not faint this time. She simply sat down hard in the grass, leaning against the rough split rails, and she watched the woman approach with eyes that could no longer focus properly. The woman's name was Martha Hayes. She was 62 years old, with iron gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, a face mapped with the lines of grief and weather, and hands that had once held a small boy named Asa as he died of lung fever in his mother's bedroom upstairs. She had not held a child in her arms in 2 years. She had not spoken kindly to anyone but the kitchen cat in 18 months. Her heart had become a small, tight thing the size of a walnut, hard and dry. She set down her milking buckets and walked over to the fence and looked down at the young woman crumpled there. She saw the dust-caked wedding dress. She saw the cracked lips and the sunburned cheekbones. She saw the cornflower blue eyes, exactly the color of Eleanor's eyes had been when Eleanor first came to this ranch as a bride in the autumn of 1872. Something cracked inside Martha Hayes. She knelt down in the grass. She put her arms around Clara's shoulders. She helped her stand. "Come with me, child," she whispered. "Come with me, come with me. Do not say a word. Just come with me." She led Clara into the milking barn, sat her down on a wooden stool, and brought her warm milk straight from the morning pail and a piece of biscuit from her own apron pocket. She watched Clara eat with the careful slowness of someone who had nearly forgotten how. Then Martha Hayes did something she had not done in 2 years. She made a decision on her own. She went out the back of the milking barn and walked to the bunkhouse and rapped on the door of the foreman's quarters. Hank Bishop opened the door in his suspenders with his face still wet from the wash basin. He was a man of 55, weather-beaten and stern, with a steel-gray mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He had worked for the Whitaker family for 20 years. He had carried small Asa on his shoulders through the corrals and taught the boy how to tell a good horse from a poor one. "Hank," Martha said, "I need you to come to the milking barn. There is a girl. She came up the mountain on foot. She is in a wedding dress." Hank Bishop looked at Martha for a long moment. Then he reached for his hat and his coat, and he followed her without a word. He sat across from Clara in the milking barn while she finished the milk. He listened while she told her story in fragments between breaths. The dead fiancé, the mining accident, the 5 days in the boarding house, the journey on foot. He looked at her boots, which had no soles left at all, and at her feet, which were a bloody mess of blisters and cracked skin. He looked at her trunk, which she had carried somehow up the mountain, and which she had set down beside her without remembering when. He nodded toward it. "May I?" he asked. Clara nodded. She was too tired to refuse anything. Hank knelt and opened the trunk. Inside, on top of folded clothes, was a small leather-bound notebook. He picked it up carefully and opened it. The pages were filled with the most beautiful handwriting he had ever seen in 2 languages, with detailed pen and ink drawings of plants. There were diagrams of human bones, with notations about which herbs healed, which fractures. There were recipes for tinctures and salves and decoctions. There were notes in the margins from at least 3 different hands going back what looked like 100 years. Hank Bishop had grown up in the hills of Tennessee. His own grandmother had kept a notebook like this. She had been the only doctor for 50 miles in any direction. He closed the book gently and looked at Martha. "We will not tell Mr. Ezra," he said. Martha nodded. "The laundry girl ran off 3 days ago with that peddler from Cheyenne. We need a laundress. Miss Holloway is your second cousin from St. Louis come to find work after a tragedy. That is all anyone needs to know." Martha nodded again, and for the first time in 2 years, a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. So Clara Holloway became a ghost on Whitaker Ridge. She slept on a cot in the corner of the laundry shed behind the main house. She rose at 4 each morning to start the great copper kettles boiling. She scrubbed the shirts and trousers and long underwear of 18 ranch hands in tubs of lye soap and steaming water. Her hands, already rough from the long walk, became red and chapped. The pads of her fingers split open and bled, but she had food, plain stew and cornbread and coffee, and she had a roof, and she had walls between herself and the world. For 3 weeks, none of the 3 Whitaker brothers knew she existed. She saw them, of course. She saw Ezra most often riding out at dawn to check the fences on the southern boundary, his great chestnut mare moving easily beneath him, his shoulders set as if against an invisible weight. She saw Gideon going in the opposite direction, alone with his rifle and a coil of rope, hunting or scouting the property lines, the mountains swallowing him for days at a time. She saw Elias most clearly. He worked in the stables and the corrals just 50 yards from the laundry shed, and she watched him through the small window above her wash tubs as he gentled young horses with patient hands and quiet words. But she did not let any of them see her. She was a shape moving behind a window, a shadow in the laundry yard, a name that none of them yet knew. In the evenings when her work was done and the long mountain twilight stretched on past 9 o'clock, she walked, not toward the town, not toward the road. She walked into the woods behind the ranch, into the high meadows above the timber line, into the cool, shaded creek beds, where mountain plants grew that she had only read about in her grandmother's notebook. She gathered a handful of mullein here, a cluster of yarrow there, the first young leaves of coltsfoot pushing up through the snow-melt mud. She dried them on a board in the laundry shed. She ground them in a small wooden bowl. She stored them in tiny pouches she sewed from scraps of cloth and hid in the rafters above her cot. It was knowledge her grandmother had given her, knowledge she had thought she might never use again. But here on a mountainside 2,000 miles from St. Louis, the plants were the same plants. The remedies were the same remedies. The work of her hands was the same work that her grandmother had done, and her grandmother before her, going back further than anyone could remember. She was making something. She was not yet sure what. On the night of the next full moon, she slipped out of the laundry shed an hour before midnight with a small basket and a paring knife. The mullein she needed for the tincture she was building had to be cut beneath a full moon to hold its strength, so her grandmother had said, and so Clara believed. She went up into the pine woods behind the horse pasture, into a clearing she had found on a previous walk, where the moonlight pooled like silver water. She knelt in the wet grass and began to cut the long velvet leaves. She did not hear the man approach. The first she knew of his presence was the sudden snap of a twig behind her. She froze. Her heart leapt into her throat. Slowly she turned her head. A great dark shape stood at the edge of the clearing. For one terrible moment she thought it was a bear. Then the shape stepped into the moonlight, and she saw the broad shoulders, the chestnut hair, the amber eyes, and she recognized the youngest of the three brothers, Elias Whittaker. He was holding a halter and a length of rope. He had been searching for one of the mares, a gentle mountain-bred horse named Belle, who had pushed her way through a weak section of fence some time after dark. He stared down at Clara. She stared up at him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. He looked at the basket beside her. He looked at the knife in her hand. He looked at the velvet mullein leaves laid carefully on a square of cloth. "Mullein," he said softly, "and yarrow. My grandmother used to gather these." Clara's voice would not work at first. When it did, it came out as barely a whisper. "I am sorry. I did not mean to trespass. I work in the laundry. Martha said I was a cousin. I needed these for. He held up a hand to stop her. He was not angry. He was looking at her as if he were trying to remember something from a long time ago. "My grandmother," he said. "Margaret Whittaker. She was a healer. She taught school in the hills of Tennessee before she came west. She used to make a salve from these very leaves when I was a boy. When I broke my arm at the age of 8, falling from a hayloft, she set the bone with 2 splints of pine and a paste of mullein and comfrey. The bone healed straight as an arrow. The town doctor said it was a miracle." Clara nodded slowly. She did not yet know what to say. Elias looked at her for a long moment more. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Miss," he said, "could you come to the stables tomorrow night after dark, when no one is about?" She blinked. "I do not understand." "My horse," he said. "Belle, the one I am looking for tonight. She has been favoring her right foreleg for 3 weeks. I have used every poultice I know. The town veterinarian came out and said she would never run sound again. He suggested I put her down." He paused. "I cannot put her down. She was the first horse I ever broke to saddle. She is 12 years old and she has never thrown a rider. I cannot." He swallowed. "If you know the old ways, if your grandmother taught you, could you look at her?" Clara stood up slowly. The moonlight fell on her face, and Elias Whittaker saw her clearly for the first time, and something in his expression softened in a way that she would only understand later. "Yes," she said, "I will look at your horse." She did not yet know it, but she had just stepped through a door that could not be closed again. She did not yet know that 20 miles away, in a dirty saloon in Salvation Creek, a thin, pock-faced man with cold, dead eyes was just then arriving on the evening stage from St. Louis, asking the bartender questions about a young woman who had come through town 6 weeks ago in a wedding dress. She did not yet know that down in the town a Boston minister named Silas Hobart was already preparing his Sunday sermon about the dangers of folk witchcraft and the women who practiced it. She did not yet know that in the main house of the ranch behind a closed door, at the end of a long hallway, dust was settling on the small bed where a 4-year-old boy named Asa had died 2 winters ago, and his father, the oldest of the 3 brothers. The man with whiskey-colored eyes, who had given her his last meal in the dust of the road, was sitting alone at his desk with a glass of bourbon in front of him and a photograph in his hand, and he was thinking, for reasons he could not quite explain, about the strange young woman in the wedding dress who had whispered, "I am sorry," when he told her she could not die on the road. She did not yet know any of these things. She knew only that in 3 weeks a stranger had given her a piece of bread, and that piece of bread had brought her here to a moonlit clearing in the mountains where another stranger was asking her to help save a horse. And she knew with the deep certainty that her grandmother had taught her to trust above all else that a debt was a debt, and it was time to begin paying it back. The summer of 1878 came slowly to Whitaker Ridge. The high mountain meadows turned from the pale green of new grass to the deep emerald of full growth, and the wildflowers Clara had only read about in her grandmother's notebook began to bloom across the slopes in waves of color that took her breath away. Indian paintbrush, mountain larkspur, columbine, lupine. She walked among them in the early mornings before the laundry work began, her basket on her arm, gathering what she needed and leaving the rest to grow. She had been moved 3 weeks after the night with Belle from the laundry shed into a small room at the back of the main house. The room was barely larger than a closet with a single window looking east toward the rising sun, but it had a real bed with a goose-down mattress and a small wooden chair where she could sit and read in the evenings. Martha had given her 2 new dresses, plain calico work dresses, blue and yellow, and a sturdy pair of boots that fit her feet exactly. No one ever told her where the boots had come from. She did not ask. Her work changed too. She no longer scrubbed the laundry. A new girl had been hired from town for that, a thin, quiet creature named Prudence, who never spoke unless spoken to. Clara worked now in the kitchen, helping Martha prepare 3 meals a day for the household and the 18 ranch hands. She baked bread at 4 in the morning and again at noon. She made stews and roasts and pies from the apples that grew in the small orchard behind the smokehouse. She learned to handle the great cast-iron stove that ran the length of one wall with its 6 burners and its 2 ovens and its temperamental moods. And she planted a garden. It was a small patch of disturbed earth behind the kitchen, perhaps 10 feet by 20, in a place where someone had once started a flower bed and then abandoned it. Clara cleared the weeds. She turned the soil with a rusted spade she found in the tool shed. She planted rosemary and thyme and sage from cuttings Martha had kept alive on the kitchen windowsill for years. She planted lavender from seeds her grandmother had pressed into a folded paper and labeled in careful script. She planted feverfew and chamomile and lemon balm, transplanted from the wild patches she found in the woods. By the middle of June, the garden was lush and fragrant, and Clara would stand at its edge in the evenings with her hands on her hips and feel for the first time in many years that she had made something that belonged to her. The 3 Whitaker brothers responded to her presence in ways that were as different as the brothers themselves. Elias was the first and the easiest. After the night Clara had healed Belle's leg with a poultice of comfrey root and willow bark, and a hot compress of mullein, after the mare had walked sound again within 2 weeks and was running in the high pasture by the end of May. Elias had begun to come to the kitchen every evening. He brought books with him, sometimes a worn copy of Shakespeare's collected plays, sometimes a botanical reference written by an English clergyman in the previous century, sometimes a slim volume of poetry by a man named Whitman that Clara found difficult and strange, but that Elias read aloud with a quiet reverence that made her listen anyway. He would sit at the long kitchen table with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and he would read while Clara mended clothes by the light of an oil lamp, and the easy silences between his sentences felt like the most companionable silences she had ever known. He told her about Asa, the way the boy had laughed when Elias tickled the soles of his feet, the way he had called Elias Uncle LL when he was first learning to talk, the way he had insisted at the age of 3 that he wanted to be a horse when he grew up, not ride one, but be one. Elias told these stories with tears sometimes glittering in his amber eyes, but he told them with the kind of love that did not break, only deepened as the years went by. Gideon was harder. He never sat down in her kitchen. He never opened a book in front of her. He came in for meals and sat at his usual place at the long pine table, and he ate in silence, and he watched her with eyes that gave away nothing. But Clara began to notice things, small things. He took longer with his meals than he needed to. He drank cup after cup of her coffee even on the warmest evenings. When she set a plate of biscuits on the table, his hand would brush hers, and he would mutter an apology, and his ears would turn red beneath his sun-darkened skin. One night in late June, Gideon developed a deep, rasping cough. He sat at the dinner table trying to suppress it, drinking water in long pulls, his face growing pale beneath the tan. Clara watched him without seeming to watch him. The next morning, before he came down for breakfast, she set a small clay teapot at his place at the table. The pot held an infusion of thyme leaves and dried elderberry sweetened with honey. There was no note. He looked at it for a moment when he sat down. Then he picked it up and poured himself a cup. He drank 3 cups of it in silence, and the cough began to ease before he had finished. He never said a word about it. But that evening, when Clara stepped out the kitchen door to throw out the dishwater, she found a freshly skinned and cleaned wild rabbit hanging from a hook on the porch beam. There was no note. She knew who had left it. She made it into a pie the next day, and Gideon ate 3 pieces, and he looked at her once briefly across the table, and the corner of his mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. That was Gideon's way. He could not say thank you. He could not say I am glad you are here. He could only kill a rabbit and leave it on the porch and trust that she would understand. Ezra was the most difficult of all. For 2 weeks after the night he had walked into the stables and seen Clara kneeling beside Belle, Ezra avoided her completely. He took his meals in the small dining room rather than the kitchen. He came home late from the south pasture and went directly to his study. When Clara passed him in the hallway, he nodded but did not look at her. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had not come to Whitaker Ridge to be looked at. She had come to find shelter, and shelter she had found, and the rest was only foolishness. But she could not stop watching him. She watched him from the kitchen window in the mornings as he saddled his great chestnut mare in the cold blue dawn light. She watched him at the supper table in the evenings, where he sat at the head of the long table with his brothers, eating in his careful, methodical way, his amber eyes fixed on the middle distance as if he were always seeing something the others could not see. She watched the way he carried his shoulders slightly drawn up, slightly forward, like a man bracing against a wind that no one else could feel. In the second week of July, a hard summer storm rolled down from the high peaks just before sunset. Black thunderheads stacked against the western mountains, and the rain came in sheets that turned the ranch yard into a slick of red mud
within minutes. The ranch hands ran the horses into the barns. Martha pulled the shutters closed across the kitchen windows. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the roof beams of the main house.
Ezra had been out riding the southern fence line a full day's ride from the ranch, and he did not come home before dark. Clara kept his supper warm on the back of the stove. She wrapped his plate in a clean cloth. She kept the coffee hot. He came in just before midnight, soaked to the skin. He had taken off his hat at the door, and his chestnut hair was plastered dark against his skull. His leather vest was black with rain. His boots squelched water onto the kitchen floor. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond the ride, beyond the storm. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with a basket of mending in her lap, working by lamplight. She looked up when he came in. He looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I kept your supper warm," she said quietly. He did not answer. He walked to the stove. He picked up the plate. He carried it to the table and sat down across from her, and he ate with the slow, tired hunger of a man who had not eaten since before dawn. She did not speak. She returned to her mending. She was sewing a long tear in the sleeve of one of his work shirts, the linen worn thin from years of use. When he had finished his plate, he did not rise. He sat looking at her hands as they worked. The needle flashed in and out of the fabric. Her fingers, soft and careful, made the small, precise stitches her grandmother had taught her when she was 8 years old. "You have a light touch," he said. His voice was so quiet, she almost did not hear it. She did not look up. She did not stop sewing. She was afraid that if she did, the moment would break. "My grandmother taught me," she said. He was silent for a long time. "Is she still living?" he asked. "She died 4 years ago, the winter of 1874, in Missouri." He nodded slowly. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My grandmother," he said. "Margaret Whitaker. She was a healer, too. She died when I was 12. I still remember the way her hands smelled, like rosemary and earth, and something sweet I never could put a name to." Clara raised her eyes from the mending. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The hard set of his jaw had softened. The amber of his eyes had warmed. He looked for the first time since she had known him like a man who was alive inside. "A niece, perhaps," she said softly. "My grandmother kept anise in her apron pockets. She said it was good for the breath." Ezra Whitaker smiled. It was a small smile, and it was a sad smile, and it lasted only a moment before it disappeared. But Clara saw it, and she would remember it later in the worst hours of her life as the moment when she first understood with a quiet certainty that she had fallen in love with him. The night that everything changed came 2 nights later. It came with the foal. Ezra Whitaker owned a great black stallion named Thunder, a Kentucky-bred animal he had purchased for $800 on a trip to Lexington in 1873. Thunder had sired 5 foals on the ranch's best mares, but only one had survived to standing. A black filly born in April, the spitting image of her father with the same star on her forehead and the same flash of white at her left forelock. Ezra had named her Hope. He had not gone to look at her in the corral once since she was born. Elias understood. Gideon understood. The little black filly was 4 months old that summer, and she was the first new life on the ranch since Asa had died. On the night of the 18th of July, Hope spiked a fever. Elias found her at sunset, lying in the deep straw of her stall, her small sides heaving, her breath coming in the same wet, rasping rattle that haunted every man on Whitaker Ridge. He sent for the veterinarian from the next county. The vet rode all night and arrived at dawn. He examined the filly. He shook his head. "Lung fever. Same that came through last winter. I have lost 6 foals to it this year already. I am sorry, Mr. Whitaker. I would put a bullet in her now and spare her the suffering." Ezra Whitaker stood in the stable doorway with his hat in his hand. His amber eyes were fixed on the small black shape in the straw. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there for a long time, and then he turned and walked out of the stable, and Gideon watched him go and did not follow. Elias found Clara in the kitchen at midnight. She was banking the cook stove for the night. He came through the back door with rainwater still on his shoulders. "Clara." She turned. She saw his face. "What is it?" "Hope. The filly. She's dying. The vet says lung fever. He has gone home. He says she will be dead by morning." Clara untied her apron without speaking. "My grandmother," she said, "wrote down a recipe for foals with congested lungs. I have never used it on anything larger than a child, but I have the herbs. I have everything I need." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Ezra walked away an hour ago. I think he went up to the high pasture. He cannot watch another small thing die. If we lose Hope tonight, I do not know what he will do." "Then we will not lose her," said Clara. She gathered her satchel. They walked together through the wet darkness to the stable. Hope lay in the straw. Her flanks were heaving. White foam flecked her muzzle. Her eyes were half open and dull, and she did not lift her head when Clara knelt beside her. Clara worked through the night. She brewed a strong infusion of mullein flower and coltsfoot leaf and white horehound sweetened with wild honey. She steeped it strong and let it cool. She lifted the small black head into her lap and dripped the tea between the foal's parted lips, one drop at a time. She rubbed pine resin salve into the hot black coat over the lungs. She had Elias bring buckets of hot water, and she draped wet sheets over a frame of sawhorses to make a steam tent above the foal's head, just as her grandmother had done for human patients. Elias sat against the wall of the stall and watched her work. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He understood somehow that he was witnessing a kind of work that did not belong to him. The sun came up over the eastern ridge. Hope was still alive. Her breathing had deepened. Her eyes were closed now, but in sleep, not in death. The stable door creaked open. Ezra Whitaker stood there in the gray morning light. He had been out all night. His clothes were soaked. His hat was in his hand. His face was the face of a man who had not slept and who had been crying alone in a high meadow, although neither Clara nor Elias would ever say so to him. He stared at the foal. He stared at Clara kneeling in the straw with the small black head still cradled in her lap. His amber eyes filled. He did not speak. He walked into the stall. He knelt down on the other side of Hope. He laid one large calloused hand against the foal's neck. He felt the warm, steady pulse beneath his palm. He felt the small chest rising and falling. "You did this," he said. His voice was a whisper. "My grandmother did this," said Clara. "I only remembered it." He looked up at her across the body of his living foal. "What did you use?" he asked. She told him. He listened. When she had finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, looking down at his hand on Hope's neck. "There was a winter when my grandmother kept 4 children alive in our family with that same recipe," he said. I had forgotten. I had forgotten that anyone ever survived this. He did not say more. He did not have to. Hope was on her feet within 3 days, walking sound by the end of the week, running across the pasture by the end of August.
And Ezra Whittaker came down to the stable every morning that summer to look at her. It was the first thing in 2 years he had visited every morning for any reason at all. There was a door at the end of the upstairs hallway that was always closed. Dust gathered thick on the floorboards in front of it. The brass handle was tarnished from disuse. None of the household staff cleaned that part of the hallway. Martha had told Clara in a whisper that she was never to open that door, never to dust in front of it, never even to walk past it more than necessary. It was Asa's room. One afternoon in late July, Clara was sweeping the upper hallway when she came around the corner and saw Ezra standing before that closed door. His hand was on the brass handle. His whole body was rigid. He stood there for what must have been 3 full minutes, his shoulders trembling slightly, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out beneath the stubble. He did not open the door. He did not turn the handle. He simply stood with his hand on the brass and his head slightly bowed like a man at a graveside. Then he turned and walked away, and his face when he passed Clara was harder than she had ever seen it. She did not speak to him. She did not even raise her eyes. She knew without being told that what she had witnessed was not meant to be witnessed. That evening when Elias came to the kitchen with his book, Clara asked him. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "That is Asa's room, and the room next to it was Eleanor's. Eleanor was Ezra's wife. They have been closed for 2 years now. None of us have opened them, not once. Everything is exactly as it was the day they died. Eleanor's dresses still hang in the wardrobe. Asa's wooden horse is still on the windowsill. His little boots are still on the floor by the bed. Ezra cannot bring himself to open them, and neither can Gideon or I." Clara nodded slowly. "Will he ever open them?" Elias looked at her for a long moment. "I do not know. 2 years ago I would have said no. 6 months ago I would have said no. Now I think perhaps. Perhaps." The first week of August brought a sickness that rolled down from the upper pastures like a slow gray wave. Lung fever. The same illness that had killed Eleanor Whittaker and her 4-year-old son 2 winters before. It did not come in epidemic strength, not like 1876. It came as a few scattered cases. An old-timer at one of the neighboring ranches. A woman in town who had been weak from a difficult childbirth. A traveling preacher who had passed through Salvation Creek and collapsed at the stage station. And then it came to the foreman's son. Obadiah Bishop was 7 years old. He had hair the color of late summer wheat, and eyes the color of his mother Esther's blue china teacups, and he had been Asa's playmate before Asa died. Clara had only met the boy a few times. He came to the ranch occasionally with his mother to help in the kitchen, and he had a habit of standing very close to Clara when she was kneading bread dough, watching with a serious expression as if he were learning a skill of profound importance. On the 3rd day of August, Obadiah came down with a high fever and a cough that rattled in his small chest like dried beans in a tin. Hank Bishop sent for Doc Barnabas Thorne in Salvation Creek. The doctor came that afternoon on his bay gelding, a black bag strapped to his saddle, his coat brushed clean and his collar starched white, as if he were going to a wedding rather than a sickbed. Doc Thorne was 50 years old and well pleased with himself. He had been the only physician in the territory for 15 years, and he had grown accustomed to being the highest medical authority in any room he entered.
He believed in bleeding for fever. He believed in the patent medicines he ordered by mail from Chicago, mostly opium-based tinctures that quieted patients without curing them. He believed in his own infallibility above all else. For 3 days, Doc Thorne treated Obadiah Bishop. He bled the boy from the arm with leeches he kept in a glass jar. He dosed him with a tonic that smelled of camphor and something darker. He prescribed cold compresses and hot mustard plasters in alternation. He charged Hank Bishop $2 a day for the treatment, and the boy got worse. By the morning of August 7th, Obadiah's lips had taken on a faint blue tinge, and his breath came in shallow, desperate gasps that Esther Bishop could hear from the next room. Doc Thorne arrived at his usual hour, examined the boy, and emerged from the bedroom shaking his head. "His constitution is weak," he told Hank in the parlor. "I have done all I can. It is in God's hands now. I would suggest you fetch the minister." Esther Bishop stood in the kitchen doorway and heard those words, and something inside her broke and reformed in the same instant. She did not say anything to Doc Thorne. She did not say anything to her husband. She walked out the back door of her small frame house, climbed into her wagon, and drove the 4 miles up the mountain to Whitaker Ridge alone. She came to the kitchen door of the main house at 6 in the morning. Her face was streaked with dried tears. Her dress was crumpled. Her gray-streaked brown hair had come loose from its pins. She did not knock. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at Clara, who was kneading bread at the long table. "Doc Thorne is killing my boy," Esther said. Her voice was low and flat and completely steady. "I know it. I can feel it. You save the foal. Please, please save my Obadiah." Clara set down the dough. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked past Esther into the dining room where she could see Ezra sitting at the head of the table with a cup of coffee, his face turned toward the kitchen door. He had heard every word. His face was a battle. Clara could see it. The terror of touching another life and losing it. The memory of his own son, the same age, taken by the same disease. The fear of failure. The fear of hope. Gideon was leaning against the wall by the window, his arms folded across his chest. He spoke without looking at his older brother. "Let her go," he said quietly. "I will go with her. If Doc Thorne makes a fuss, I will handle him." Ezra stared at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he raised his eyes and looked directly at Clara. He held her gaze for what felt like a long time. There were 100 things in his eyes: fear, trust, memory, hope. He nodded once, briefly, almost imperceptibly. Clara untied her apron. "Let me get my satchel," she said. Doc Thorne was standing in the front parlor of the Bishop home when Clara and Gideon arrived. He was packing his black bag with the unhurried competence of a man who had pronounced his judgment and considered the matter closed. He looked up when the door opened, and his face went through 3 rapid changes when he saw who had entered. Surprise, recognition, outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Clara did not answer. She was already moving past him toward the bedroom door. Doc Thorne stepped sideways to block her path. "Madam, you will not enter that sick room. You have no medical license. You have no training. You are practicing without authority, and I will report you to the sheriff." He had drawn himself up to his full height, which was perhaps 5 feet 8. He was wearing a clean white collar and a freshly brushed coat. He looked by his own measure like a man of authority. Gideon Whitaker stepped between Clara and the doctor. He did not speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not put his hand near the revolver at his belt. He simply stood there and looked down at Doc Thorne. He was 9 inches taller than the physician and probably 40 pounds heavier, and he carried with him the weathered calm of a man who had been a border lawman in Laramie for 6 years and who had drawn his weapon in earnest 17 times and had killed 3 men and never once felt the need to brag about it. He just looked at Doc Thorne. Doc Thorne, who had faced down belligerent patients and angry husbands and the occasional drunk in his 15 years of practice, suddenly felt a coldness travel down his spine that he had not felt since he was a boy in Pennsylvania, the day his father had come home from the war with a haunted look in his eyes. He looked into Gideon Whittaker's amber eyes, and he understood with absolute clarity that if he did not step aside, something very bad was going to happen to him in the next 10 seconds. He picked up his black bag. He picked up his hat. He walked past Gideon and Clara without another word, and he did not stop walking until he had reached his horse, and he did not look back as he rode away from the Bishop place at a hard trot. Clara worked through the night. She brewed a strong infusion of mullein flower and coltsfoot leaf and white horehound sweetened with wild honey from a comb Martha had given her that morning. She had Esther boil great kettles of water and arrange them in a circle around the boy's bed so the steam rose around him in clouds. She rubbed the boy's small chest with a salve made from pine resin and goose fat. She lifted his head and dripped the herbal tea between his cracked lips, one slow drop at a time. She bathed his fever-burning forehead with cool cloths. Gideon stood at the doorway of the bedroom for the entire night. He did not sit down. He did not speak. He simply stood there like a man on guard duty, his arms folded, his eyes watching the windows and the front door of the house. Esther Bishop sat in a rocking chair in the corner with her rosary beads moving silently between her fingers. Hank Bishop paced the kitchen, pouring himself cup after cup of coffee that he never drank. By 3 in the morning, the boy's breathing had begun to deepen. By dawn, his fever had broken. By the time the sun came over the eastern ridge, Obadiah Bishop opened his eyes and looked up at Clara with confused exhaustion and asked for a glass of water. Esther Bishop fell to her knees and wept. Hank Bishop, 55-year-old foreman of the Whittaker Ridge Ranch, hard man and former cavalry sergeant, knelt down beside Clara on the floor of his son's bedroom, and he took her chapped, reddened hand in both of his rough hands and he kissed it. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. Gideon drove the wagon back up the mountain in the slow gray light of dawn. Clara sat beside him on the bench seat, her satchel of herbs in her lap, her body trembling slightly with exhaustion and a strange exhilaration she had not felt before. They rode in silence for the first mile. Then Gideon spoke. In the winter of '76, he set his eyes on the road ahead. I was working as a border marshal out of Laramie. There was a band of cattle thieves operating along the Wyoming-Nebraska line. 8 men. They had killed 2 homesteaders the previous fall. I had been chasing them for 6 months. He paused. Clara waited. I got a letter from my mother in early February. Eleanor was sick. Asa was sick. Lung fever, the same that is going around now. The letter said, "Come home if you can." My mother was not a woman given to alarm. If she said come home, it meant come home immediately. He stopped the wagon at the top of a rise. The whole valley spread out below them in the morning light. I had the cattle thieves in my sights 3 days later. I knew where they were camped. I could have ridden home that morning. Instead, I stayed. I told myself I would catch them and then ride. 3 more days, I told myself. 3 more days and I would be done. I caught them on the 4th day. I killed 2 and the others surrendered. I rode home as fast as my horse could carry me. He gripped the reins tighter. Asa was already dead. He had died on the second day. Eleanor died 2 days after I arrived. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, and she did not know me at the end. My brother Ezra sat on the other side and held her other hand. After the funerals, I turned in my badge. I have never worn one since. Clara did not speak. She could not. Gideon turned and looked at her for the first time since they had left the bishop house. 3 days, he said. 3 days I was too late. 3 days that have followed me every day for the past 2 years and will follow me until I die. His amber eyes were wet. You were not too late, he said. You came in time for that boy. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what a precious thing that is? He turned away. He shook the reins. The wagon rolled forward. Clara reached out after a long moment and laid her small, soft hand on his great calloused fist where it gripped the reins. He did not pull away, but the news of what had happened at the bishop house traveled down the mountain faster than the wagon. By the time Clara and Gideon reached Whitaker Ridge, Doc Thorne had already returned to Salvation Creek. By that afternoon, he had visited the home of Reverend Silas Hobart. The new minister recently arrived from Boston, and the two men had spent 3 hours in the parsonage talking in low, intense voices. Reverend Hobart was 38 years old, thin and pale, with a high white forehead and the long, delicate hands of a scholar. He had graduated from Harvard Divinity School with high honors. He had come west 3 months ago with the conviction that the souls of the frontier needed firm theological correction, and that the loose folk superstitions of the Irish and the Scottish and the Cornish settlers, the herb women and the granny midwives and the mountain healers, were nothing less than the residue of pagan witchcraft, the old evil dressed in homespun cotton. He had heard during his short time in Salvation Creek the rumors about a strange young woman on Whitaker Ridge who had cured a dying foal with weeds. He had filed the information away as something to address eventually. Now, with Doc Thorne sitting in his parlor with his hands shaking with humiliation and rage, the Reverend understood that the time had come. The next Sunday, Reverend Hobart preached for 90 minutes on the dangers of folk witchcraft. He named no names. He did not need to. The congregation understood. He spoke of Eve and the serpent. He spoke of the women in the Gospels who had been possessed by unclean spirits. He spoke of the women of the New England witch trials 200 years ago who had pretended to cure the sick, while in truth they had been instruments of the devil. The whispers in Salvation Creek began that very afternoon. By the end of August, women who had once nodded at Clara on her rare trips to town now crossed the street to avoid her. Children stared. The proprietor of the general store served her without speaking. The town was gathering itself slowly against her. She felt it. So did the Whitaker brothers. So did Hank Bishop and Esther Bishop, who continued to bring fresh eggs to the kitchen of the main house every week and to thank Clara each time in defiance of the gathering whispers. Clara did not yet know that worse was coming. She did not yet know that on the evening of August 28th, the evening stage from the east rolled into Salvation Creek with a thin, pock-faced man in a black travel coat who climbed down stiffly and stretched his back and walked directly to the saloon. She did not yet know that Cornelius Pratt had finally arrived. He sat at the long bar at the Lucky Star Saloon and ordered a glass of whiskey. He drank it slowly. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Pete Hawkins, looked him over with the practiced eye of a man who had served drinks to thousands of strangers and learned to read each one. "What brings you to our little corner of the territory, friend?" Hawkins asked. Cornelius set down his glass. His cold, dead eyes settled on the bartender's face. "I am looking for my sister," he said. "She came through here back in May. Heavy-set young woman, honey blonde hair. She was wearing a wedding dress when she arrived. Her name is Clara Holloway, but she may be using my last name Pratt. I am very worried about her. She has been mentally unwell since our grandmother died. She stole money from me and ran away." Pete Hawkins poured himself a small glass of whiskey, which he allowed himself only twice a week. He drank it in one swallow. "That girl," he said. "Yes, I remember her. She came through in May, stayed 3 days at Mrs. Crowley's boarding house. Then she walked north out of town. We thought she was going to Cheyenne, but word came back later that she had ended up at the Whitaker place. They took her in. She is up there now working in their kitchen. They have her like a princess from what I hear." Cornelius Pratt smiled. It was not a good smile. "Thank you very much," he said. He paid for his drink with a silver dollar. He walked out of the saloon and down the dusty street to the office of Doc Barnabas Thorne, where a light still burned in the window despite the late hour, and where Reverend Silas Hobart was just then sitting in the second chair drinking tea, planning his next move. The three men spoke together for many hours that night. They discovered very quickly that they had a great deal in common. The morning of September the 2nd was clear and warm, with the first hint of autumn in the air. Clara had been at Whitaker Ridge for almost 4 months. She rose before dawn, as was her habit, and started the kitchen fire and put on the great copper coffee pot. She was alone in the kitchen when Ezra Whitaker came in, dressed for the day in his work clothes, his amber eyes still soft with the shadow of sleep. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He poured himself a cup of coffee. She continued kneading the bread dough on the long table. He watched her for a moment from the side of the kitchen. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had never used her first name before. It had always been Miss Holloway on the rare occasions when he had addressed her directly. Now her own name in his mouth made her face flush red. "I need to fetch some flour from the storeroom," she said quickly, turning away. "The barrel here is almost empty." She walked to the storeroom at the back of the kitchen. He followed her, still holding his coffee cup. The storeroom was a long, narrow space with floor-to-ceiling shelves on both walls, holding sacks of flour and sugar and dried beans, jars of preserves, tins of coffee and tea. The flour barrel was on the highest shelf, requiring a wooden step stool to reach. Clara dragged the stool into position. She stepped up onto it. She reached up for the barrel. The stool wobbled. She felt herself starting to fall. She gave a small cry. She felt her left foot slipping off the edge of the stool and the sack of flour tipping in her hands, and the world starting to turn the wrong way. Then his hands were on her waist, both of them, large and calloused and warm even through the cotton of her dress. He caught her around the middle and lifted her down from the stool as easily as if she were a child, and he did not set her on her feet. He pulled her against him. Her back was flush against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding through the leather of his vest. She could feel his breath warm against the loose hair at her temple. His arms were wrapped around her waist, his hands clasped in front of her, and he was holding her so tightly she could not have pulled away, even if she had wanted to, which she did not. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The kitchen was silent except for the soft crackle of the cook stove and the distant sound of a rooster crowing in the yard. His chin came down to rest lightly against the top of her head. She closed her eyes. For one long, perfect moment she allowed herself to imagine that this was her life, that she had a husband, that this was an ordinary morning in an ordinary kitchen, that nothing was coming for her down the mountain road. Then he stepped back. He let her go. He cleared his throat. He turned toward the storeroom door, and his face was flushed beneath the tan, and he could not quite meet her eyes. "Be careful on that stool," he said roughly. "Have one of the hands move the barrel down." He walked out of the storeroom. Clara stood for a moment with her hand pressed against her chest where his arms had just been. Her heart was beating so hard she thought she might be sick. She stepped out of the storeroom and into the kitchen, and she stopped. Hank Bishop was standing in the open doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. He had a cup of coffee in his hand. His weathered face was perfectly neutral. He was looking at Clara with an expression she could not read. He had seen everything. He nodded to her slowly, just once. Then he walked out of the kitchen without speaking, and his boots made the quiet, steady sound of a man who had observed something important and was thinking about what to do with the information. That night after supper, Clara was passing through the upstairs hallway when she heard voices from Ezra's study. The door was not quite closed. She knew she should keep walking. She stopped instead. Hank Bishop's voice came through the door, low and intense. 20 years, Ezra. 20 years I have worked for your family. I served your father when you were a boy. I helped raise you and your brothers. I am going to say something to you now that no man in my position has any right to say to a man in your position. But I am going to say it anyway, because someone needs to. There was a long silence. "Speak then, Hank," said Ezra's voice. Tired, quiet. "That girl, Clara. She has been in this house for 4 months. I have watched you in those 4 months. I watched you the year that Eleanor and Asa died. I watched you for the 18 months after that, when you walked around this ranch like a dead man wearing the skin of a living one. I have watched the change in you since this girl came. It has been small at first. Now, it is not small." A pause. "That girl is bringing you back, Ezra. She is bringing you back from the place you have been. Do not let fear kill that. Do not let fear kill you. Not again. You almost did not survive the last time. I do not believe you would survive it twice." Another long silence. Then Ezra's voice, lower, hoarse. "Get out, Hank." "I will get out. But you heard me. And you are going to think on it tonight. Good night, Ezra." The door opened. Clara pressed herself flat against the wall in the dark hallway. Hank Bishop walked past her without turning his head. He had known she was there. He had spoken so that she would hear. She stood in the dark hallway for a long time. Inside the study, she heard the sound of a chair scraping back, the soft thud of a man sitting down hard. And then, very quietly, the sound of a man who had not wept in 2 years putting his face in his hands. 3 days later, on the morning of September the 5th, Clara was hanging linens in the side yard when she saw the dust cloud coming up the long mountain road. It was no ordinary traveler. It was a column of riders. She counted them as they approached. 15 men, maybe 16. They were riding in a tight formation the way men ride when they have come on serious business. At the front rode Sheriff Augustus Brennan in his black Sunday coat. Beside him rode Doc Barnabas Thorne. Behind them rode Reverend Silas Hobart, riding awkwardly unaccustomed to the saddle. And riding beside Reverend Hobart, in a black travel coat, his face pitted with old smallpox scars, his eyes cold and patient and terrible, was a man Clara had not seen in 5 months. She dropped the wet sheet she was holding into the basket at her feet. She stared. Cornelius Pratt looked up from the road, and his eyes found her in the side yard, and he smiled. Clara turned and ran for the house. She had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached the porch steps. She had to find Ezra. Clara ran across the yard with her skirts gathered in both fists. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She came up the back steps 2 at a time, burst through the kitchen door, and found Martha at the long table chopping carrots for the noon stew. "Where is Mr. Ezra?" Martha looked up. She saw Clara's face, her knife stilled on the cutting board. "In the study, going over the ledgers. What is wrong, child?" "Riders coming up the road, 15 of them. The sheriff, the doctor, the minister, and—" Her voice broke. "And my brother." Martha did not need to be told twice. She set down her knife. She wiped her hands on her apron. "I will fetch Mr. Gideon and Mr. Elias. You go to Ezra now." Clara ran down the long hallway and pushed open the study door without knocking. Ezra was bent over a wide leather ledger, a pencil in his hand. He looked up. He saw her face. He stood at once. "Clara." "They are here. Cornelius. He is here. He is riding up the road right now with the sheriff and the doctor and the new preacher and 12 other men I have never seen before." For one long second, Ezra Whittaker did not move. His amber eyes held hers, and she saw inside them the same calculation she had seen on the road in May, when he had looked down at her dying in the dust and decided she would not die that day. Then he was moving. Past her, down the hallway, out onto the front porch. By the time Clara followed him out into the morning sunlight, Gideon had already come around from the bunkhouse with his rifle in his hands, and Elias was crossing the yard at a hard run from the stables. The 18 ranch hands were emerging from the barns and the corrals drifting toward the main house, with the unhurried purpose of men who had felt the weather change. The riders pulled up at the bottom of the porch steps in a slow, wide arc. Their horses were lathered from the climb. The men did not dismount. Sheriff Augustus Brennan touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Whittaker." "Sheriff, I am sorry to disturb you on a working morning. We have a legal matter that requires your attention." Ezra stood on the top step of the porch with his hands resting easy on his belt. Gideon stood 1 step below him on his right. Elias stood 1 step below him on his left. Hank Bishop walked up from the corral and took his place at the foot of the steps, and the 18 ranch hands gathered behind Hank in a loose half-circle, and not one of them spoke a word. "Speak then," said Ezra. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Your kitchen girl, Miss Clara Holloway, also known as Clara Pratt. She is wanted in the state of Missouri for the theft of family property. Her brother here has come a long way to take her home for treatment of her mental condition. I am here to ensure the transfer is conducted peacefully." Cornelius Pratt edged his horse forward 2 steps. He removed his hat and held it against his chest in a parody of brotherly grief. "My poor sister," he said. His voice was a thin, oily thing that crawled across the morning air. "She has not been well since our dear grandmother passed. She has imaginings. She steals things. She has caused our family great hardship. We just want to take her home and care for her properly." Reverend Silas Hobart spoke up from his saddle. "And there is the further matter, Mr. Whittaker, of the unlicensed practice of medicine and the spread of folk witchcraft in this community. Multiple witnesses have come forward. The town has lost confidence in this woman's presence on Whittaker Ridge. For the peace of the community, she must be removed." Ezra Whittaker did not look at the sheriff. He did not look at the reverend. He did not look at Doc Thorne, who sat smug and silent on his bay gelding at the back of the column. He looked at Cornelius Pratt. He looked at Cornelius Pratt for a long, unbroken moment with his amber eyes flat and cold, and Cornelius Pratt began, despite himself, to shift in his saddle. "She is not going anywhere," said Ezra. The sheriff stiffened. "Mr. Whitaker, I do not wish to cause trouble between us. I have known your family for 15 years. But the law is the law. She is a wanted woman. Her brother has come to fetch her. You will hand her over, or you will face charges of harboring a fugitive." Ezra was silent. He turned his head very slightly and looked through the open front door of the house. Clara stood just inside in the dim of the front hallway. Her face was white. Her hands were clenched against her stomach. She met his eyes through the doorway and she nodded. The smallest possible nod. "I will go. Do not let men die for me." Ezra Whitaker looked back at the sheriff. "I need an hour," he said. "Let her say her goodbyes. Let her gather her things. 1 hour, and then we will discuss what comes next." Brennan glanced at Cornelius Pratt. Pratt nodded, the smile tugging at the corners of his thin mouth. He thought he had won. 1 hour, said the sheriff. "We will wait here in the yard." Ezra turned and walked back into the house. Gideon stayed on the porch, his rifle resting easy across his thigh. Elias stayed beside him. Inside the front hallway, Ezra took Clara by both shoulders. His hands were shaking. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was low and fast. "That man out there is not going to take you to the sheriff. Look at the sheriff's eyes. Look at how he is sitting. Brennan has been bought. The minute they ride down off this mountain with you in their custody, you will disappear. Either Cornelius will keep you for himself, or he will sell you again. You understand what I am telling you?" Clara nodded. She could not speak. "You will not go with them. You will not even leave this house. Now listen carefully. I need you to do exactly what I say. Go upstairs to the attic. There is a door at the back of the 3rd floor landing behind the linen press. Martha will show you. Go up there. Lock the door behind you. Do not come down. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear from the yard. Do you understand? Ezra, they will kill people. Hank, the men, your brothers. Please." He took her face in his hands. He kissed her. It was the first time he had kissed her, and it was hard and fast and full of all the words he had not yet learned how to say. He held her face in his hands for 1 second longer, and his amber eyes were burning. "Trust me," he said. 5 months ago, you trusted me with your life on a road in the dust. Trust me now. 1 more hour. Then he was gone, back through the kitchen, out the side door, and Clara was running for the stairs. What Clara did not know, what Cornelius Pratt and the sheriff and the Reverend and Doc Thorne did not know, was that Gideon Whitaker had been a border marshal for 6 years and had not stopped being one when he turned in his badge. He had not stopped because once a man learned to read the signs, he could not unlearn them. He had not stopped because his old friends in the marshal service still sent him news now and again, and he sent them news in return. And when Cornelius Pratt had ridden into Salvation Creek 8 days earlier and had asked Pete Hawkins about the wedding dress girl, Pete Hawkins had told him what he wanted to hear, and Pete Hawkins had then walked across the street to the telegraph office and sent a wire up the mountain by way of the standing arrangement Gideon had made with him 3 years before. "A pock-faced man asking about your kitchen girl. Calls himself Pratt." Gideon Whitaker had received the message that same evening. He had not told Ezra. He had not told Clara. He had simply walked to the small carrier coop behind the bunkhouse, taken out one of the gray homing pigeons he kept there, and tied a small message to its leg. The pigeon had flown 120 miles southeast that night and landed on the windowsill of an office in Cheyenne, where a United States Marshal named Jedediah Bates had been working late at his desk. The message had read, "Need full background on man calling himself Cornelius Pratt of St. Louis, Missouri. Believe him to be a fugitive. Will detain on suspicion. Send confirmation soonest. G. Whitaker." The reply had come back by return pigeon 2 days later. It had been longer than Gideon had expected. It had also been a great deal more interesting. The man calling himself Cornelius Pratt of St. Louis was indeed Cornelius Pratt of St. Louis. That part was true, but Cornelius Pratt had a stepbrother of sorts, a cousin by marriage, a man named Mortimer Grimes, who had been wanted in 3 states for 2 years. Grimes had beaten a young woman to death in Kansas City in the autumn of 1876 when she had refused to work in a brothel he was managing. He had fled before the marshals could close on him. He had been seen in St. Louis in early 1878. He had been traveling, the marshal's report said, in the company of his cousin Cornelius Pratt. Marshal Bates had ridden out from Cheyenne 3 days ago. He had been making the journey at a hard pace. By Gideon's calculations, the marshal and his deputies should reach Salvation Creek by tomorrow morning at the latest. But Gideon had not been able to wait until tomorrow morning. The riders had come up the mountain today, and so Gideon Whitaker, standing on the porch of his brother's house in the bright September sun, had to do this part himself. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his rifle held easy across his arm. He looked down at the men in the yard. He spoke loudly enough to carry to all of them. "Mr. Pratt," he said. Cornelius Pratt looked up. "Yes. What is your full given name?" Pratt blinked. "Cornelius Augustus Pratt. Why do you ask? And the man who rode up the mountain with you, the one in the gray coat with the beard, where is he?" Pratt's face changed. "I do not know who you mean." "You came up the road with 16 men, Mr. Pratt. I count 15 now. The 16th was riding at the back. I saw him. He had a gray coat and a full brown beard, and he carried a sawed-off shotgun across his lap. Where is he?" Cornelius Pratt's hand moved slightly toward the saddlebag behind him. "Do not," said Gideon Whitaker. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved his rifle. But something in the timbre of those 2 words made Cornelius Pratt's hand stop in midair. Gideon reached into the inside pocket of his vest with his left hand. He drew out a folded paper. He unfolded it slowly. He read aloud, "Federal warrant, issued by the United States Marshal Service, Wyoming Territory, for the arrest of one Mortimer Grimes, age 37, formerly of Kansas City, Missouri, wanted on charges of murder in the first degree of one Lily Hayward in October of 1876. Said Grimes is known to travel in the company of his cousin Cornelius Pratt, also of Missouri." He looked up. "Sheriff Brennan." The sheriff had gone very still in his saddle. His face had taken on a grayish cast. "Sir," said Gideon, "you have a federal fugitive in your party. The man we just spoke of has slipped off behind the corral, I expect, while we were talking. You have a duty to find him and arrest him. You also have a duty to take this man Pratt into custody on suspicion of harboring a fugitive." Brennan's mouth opened. It closed. He looked at Cornelius Pratt. He looked at the federal warrant. He looked at the 18 ranch hands behind Hank Bishop, every one of them now with a hand near a holster or a rifle stock. "Now, Sheriff," said Cornelius Pratt. His voice had lost its oily smoothness. "This is a misunderstanding. I am sure my cousin has explained. Your cousin, said Gideon, is wanted for the murder of a young woman in Missouri, and you knew it, and you brought him onto my brother's property in the company of an officer of the law, and you tried to hand my brother's woman over to him. Cornelius Pratt drew his pistol. He was fast. He had been fast all his life. He had survived 15 years in the worst neighborhoods of St. Louis on the speed of his draw. Gideon Whittaker was faster. He had been a border marshal for 6 years. He had drawn against 3 men who meant to kill him, and he had killed all 3. He drew now without seeming to move at all. The rifle came up, and the report cracked across the yard, and Cornelius Pratt's pistol flew from his hand in a spray of blood and bone fragments. He screamed. He clutched his ruined right hand against his chest, and he toppled sideways out of the saddle and hit the dirt of the yard with a thud that knocked the wind out of him. Hank Bishop was already moving. He and 3 of the ranch hands swarmed Pratt before he could get back to his feet. They pinned him to the ground. They tied his hands behind his back, what was left of them, with quick, efficient knots. 2 more of the hands had already slipped around the corner of the corral. They came back 2 minutes later, dragging Mortimer Grimes between them. Grimes had run for it as soon as he heard the rifle. He had not made it more than 50 yards. His sawed-off shotgun lay in the dirt, where one of the hands had kicked it. Sheriff Augustus Brennan sat his horse in the middle of the yard, like a man who had been turned to stone. Gideon Whittaker spoke without looking at him. You will take these 2 men down to your jail, Sheriff. You will lock them up. You will send a wire to Marshal Bates in Cheyenne and tell him you have his fugitive in custody. You will be very polite to Marshal Bates when he arrives tomorrow, because you and I both know that the marshal is going to ask some hard questions about how this man got an arrest warrant served by the local sheriff against an innocent woman based on lies, and the answers to those questions are going to determine whether you keep your job or whether you go to a federal prison yourself. Brennan nodded slowly. His face had aged 10 years in 5 minutes. Yes, Mr. Whittaker. Reverend Hobart. The minister flinched at the sound of his name. You may go back to your church and your sermons, but know this. The next time you preach about witchcraft from your pulpit, I am going to stand up in the back row and tell the people of Salvation Creek the entire story of what happened today, including your part in it. You understand me? The Reverend did not speak. He nodded. Doc Thorne. The doctor said nothing. You may go too, but I would think hard about whether your medical practice has a future in this part of the territory. I would think very hard. The men of the column who had ridden up with the sheriff began one by one to peel away. Some of them looked ashamed. Some of them simply looked tired. Within 10 minutes, only the sheriff and his 2 prisoners remained, and the sheriff was tying Cornelius Pratt to a horse with hands that shook and would not stop shaking. When they were finally gone down the road, the dust of their passage hanging in the warm afternoon air, Gideon Whittaker turned and walked up the porch steps and into the house. Ezra met him in the front hallway. The 2 brothers looked at each other for a long moment. How long have you known? Said Ezra. Since Pete Hawkins wired me 8 days ago. Why did you not tell me? Because I knew what you would do if I told you. You would have ridden down the mountain with a rifle. You would have killed both of them in the street. And then I would have lost my brother to a hanging. So I sent for the marshal instead. Ezra closed his eyes. Thank you, he said. Gideon nodded. He set his rifle carefully against the wall. He walked past his older brother and out the back of the house, and he did not stop walking until he reached the high pasture above the corrals, and he stood there alone for a long time, looking out over the valley, and not even Elias followed him. Some grief had to be carried in private. Clara came down from the attic at sundown. Her dress was streaked with dust. Her hands trembled. Ezra met her at the foot of the stairs and pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his chest and wept until her body shook. "He is gone," Ezra said. "He is gone, Clara. He will hang for what he did. You are free. Do you hear me? You are free." She heard him. The words traveled into her and arranged themselves into a meaning she could not quite hold yet. She felt his arms around her. She felt his heart beating beneath her ear. She wept until she could not weep any longer. That evening at supper, Ezra, Gideon, Elias, and Clara sat at the long pine table together. They did not speak much. Martha brought a roast and potatoes. They ate in the soft light of the oil lamps. After the plates had been cleared, Ezra reached across the table and laid his hand over Clara's, and he did not move it for the rest of the evening, and his brothers pretended not to notice. That night the storm came. It rolled down from the high peaks just after dark the way the storms had come all summer. But this one was different. This one was a real autumn storm, the first hard storm of the changing season, with a wind that bent the cottonwood sideways and rain that came in sheets so thick a man could not see 10 feet in front of his face. Lightning split the sky over and over. The thunder shook the window panes. Ezra had stayed too long on the porch after supper. He had been standing alone in the dark, watching the storm come, his hands resting on the porch rail, his amber eyes fixed on the western horizon where the lightning danced. He had been thinking perhaps about Eleanor, about Asa, about the distance between the man he had been 3 months ago and the man he was tonight. He had not gone inside until the rain was already falling. By the time he came in through the front door, his clothes were soaked through. His chestnut hair was plastered against his forehead. He was shivering. Clara saw him pass through the front hallway. She called to him to change his clothes immediately, to dry his hair by the fire. He waved her off. He went up to his room. He fell into bed without changing. By 2 a.m, he was burning with fever. Martha came pounding on Clara's door at 3. Her gray hair was loose around her shoulders. Her face was the color of old paper. "Miss Clara, come quick. It is Mr. Ezra. He has the lung fever." The same. Clara was already pulling on her dress. She ran down the hallway in her bare feet and her unfastened dress, and she burst into Ezra's room. He was on his back in the great oak bed where he had once lain with Eleanor. The lamp on the bedside table cast a yellow glow across his face. His chestnut hair was soaked through. His skin was the color of brick. His eyes were half open and he was muttering names that nobody else could hear. Gideon was holding him down by the shoulders. Ezra was thrashing in the grip of fever dreams. Elias stood at the foot of the bed with both hands pressed against his mouth, and tears were running silently down his face. "Eleanor," Ezra was muttering. "Eleanor, I am coming." Clara crossed the room. She knelt at the side of the bed. She placed her hand against Ezra's burning forehead. She knew this fever. She had heard this rasp. She had defeated it twice already in the body of a small black foal and in the body of a 7-year-old boy, but neither of those creatures had been built like a grown man, and neither of them had been carrying 2 years of grief like a stone in his chest, and neither of them had the kind of stubborn will that Ezra Whittaker had used for the past 2 years to keep himself half dead. The fever had finally found a way in. She turned to Elias. Her voice was steady. She did not know how it was steady, but it was. "Go to my room. The wooden box at the foot of my bed. Bring it here. Bring all of it.
Bring the water from the kitchen. Heat 3 large kettles, and get every clean cloth in this house." Elias nodded and ran. She turned to Gideon. "Send a man for Doc Thorne." Gideon stared at her. "You hate Doc Thorne. He almost killed a child. The law requires that a physician attend to a patient of consequence in this territory. If something goes wrong, I cannot have it said that no doctor was called. Send for him. I will deal with him when he gets here." Gideon looked at her for 1 second longer. Then he nodded. He went out into the storm to send a rider down the mountain. Doc Barnabas Thorne arrived just before dawn, soaked to the skin and furious. He pushed past Hank Bishop in the hallway. He pushed past Martha in the doorway. He marched into Ezra's bedroom and stopped short when he saw Clara at the bedside. She was bathing Ezra's face with cool water. 3 kettles steamed in the room. The air smelled of mullein and willow bark and pine resin. "I am here as the physician of record," Doc Thorne said. "I am taking over." He moved toward the bed. Hank Bishop stepped in front of him. "You will examine Mr. Whitaker. You will record your professional opinion. Then you will leave." Doc Thorne examined Ezra. He took the pulse. He listened to the chest with his ear pressed against the heaving ribs. He stepped back. He shook his head. "His constitution is strong, but the fever is far advanced. The lungs are filling. I have seen this 7 times in 2 years, and only 1 patient survived. I am sorry, there is nothing to be done. I would suggest you call the minister. It is in God's hands." He picked up his black bag. "Thank you for your professional opinion," said Hank Bishop. "Now leave. You cannot mean to let this woman—" "Now, doctor." Doc Thorne looked around the room. He saw Clara at the bedside. He saw Gideon Whitaker standing beside the door with his rifle leaning against the wall and his eyes flat and dangerous. He saw Esther Bishop standing in the hallway behind Hank with her son Obadiah at her side, and behind them 18 ranch hands and 3 kitchen women, and Martha Hayes and old Tom from the smokehouse, all of them packed into the corridor and the stairwell, and every one of them looking at him with the same hard expression. Doc Thorne understood. He picked up his hat. He walked through the crowd. He went down the stairs and out into the rain, and the door closed behind him, and the people of Whitaker Ridge did not speak about him again. For 3 days and 3 nights Clara did not sleep. She brewed strong infusions of mullein flower and coltsfoot leaf and white horehound, and a rare mountain root her grandmother had recorded as a last resort for dying lungs. She built a tent of sheets above the bed and filled the chamber underneath with steam from the kettles. She rubbed his chest with the pine resin salve. She bathed his fever with cool spring water. She lifted his head and dripped the herbal teas between his cracked lips, 1 drop at a time, hour after hour after hour. Gideon and Elias took turns standing watch at the door. Martha brought food that Clara did not eat. The storm broke and cleared, and a second one rolled in and broke and cleared too. The world outside the bedroom ceased to exist. In the deep middle of the second night, Ezra cried out a name. Asa. He had not said his son's name aloud in 2 years. The sound of it now breaking from his cracked lips was the sound of a man drowning. Clara held a cool cloth to his forehead. She leaned close to his ear. "Asa is at peace, Ezra. He is in a good place. You have to let him go now. You have to live. I am here. I am here." She did not know if he heard her, but the violent thrashing in his limbs eased. His breathing did not improve, but it did not worsen. He held on. On the morning of the 3rd day, Gideon Whitaker came into the room and sat down across the bed from Clara. He had not slept either. His face was hollow.
His eyes were red. "I want to tell you something," he said quietly. She nodded. "In the spring after Eleanor and Asa died, I came home one afternoon and found my brother sitting at his desk in the study. He had cleaned and loaded his service revolver. He had laid it on the desk in front of him. He was looking at it. He was not thinking about whether. He was thinking about when." He swallowed. I sat down across from him. I did not take the gun away. I told him this. I told him, "Brother, if you put that pistol to your head, I am going to walk out of this house, and I am going to walk to the edge of the south pasture, and I am going to do the same thing, because I cannot live in a world where you have killed yourself. I cannot. I will not." And I sat there with him until the sun went down, and we talked of nothing, and finally he picked up the pistol and unloaded it and put it back in its drawer, and we have not spoken of that day since. His voice broke. "You are the first good thing that has happened to this family in 2 years. Save him, Clara, please, not for yourself, for all of us." Then he stood and left the room before she could answer. Elias came in an hour later. He was carrying something small and square. He sat down where Gideon had sat. He placed the small object in Clara's hand. It was a photograph. Eleanor Whitaker, 24 years old, with light brown hair piled in soft curls and a sweet, calm face, was sitting in a wing chair with her son Asa on her lap. The boy was 3 years old in the picture. He was laughing at something just off camera. His dark curly hair was the chestnut of his father. "Eleanor," said Elias, "knew she was dying before any of us did. 2 days before she went, she sent for me. Just me. She made me sit beside her bed. She had something she wanted me to remember and to repeat one day to whoever needed to hear it." He paused. She said, "Tell Ezra that love is not a finite quantity. Tell him that a grown man's heart still has room in it for the next person. Tell him when the time comes to receive what is offered. Tell him not to refuse the second harvest because he grieves the first." Elias looked at Clara with eyes that were filled with tears. "Eleanor knew you were coming. Maybe not you specifically, but someone. She prepared him to receive you. So you save him now, Clara. You save him. Because this is the harvest," she meant. Clara wept. She wept while she went on dripping the tea between Ezra's lips. She wept while she changed the cool cloths on his forehead. She wept while she held the photograph against her heart and asked a woman she had never met for the strength to finish the work that woman had begun. The fever broke at dawn on the 3rd day. It happened slowly. The shallow, rasping breath began to deepen. The violent shivering eased. The brick-red color drained from his face, leaving the skin pale, but no longer terrible. Clara laid her palm against his forehead. The heat had gone. She pressed her forehead against the back of his hand, and she let herself finally fall into the kind of weeping that comes when the body remembers it has been holding itself together for too long. An hour later, Ezra Whitaker opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the window where the morning sun was just touching the curtains. He turned his head. He saw her. His amber eyes were clear. "Clara," he said. His voice was a hoarse whisper, but it was him. It was him. He lifted one weak hand. She caught it in both of her own. She brought it to her lips. She kissed his knuckles, his palm, the inside of his wrist. "You repaid a piece of bread with a life," he whispered. "A debt is a debt," she answered. He smiled. It was a real smile, the first one she had ever seen reach all the way to his eyes. "That is not what this is anymore," he said. "That has not been what this is for a long time." She lowered her face to his and rested her forehead against his. "I know," she said. "Marry me." "Yes."
That was all. There was nothing more to say. Marshal Jedediah Bates rode into Whitaker Ridge 5 days later with 4 deputies. He was a man of 60, lean and hard, with 35 years of federal service behind him. He sat on the porch with Gideon and a recovering Ezra and drank coffee and asked questions. He had Cornelius Pratt and Mortimer Grimes in shackles in the Salvation Creek jail. They would be transferred to Cheyenne by the end of the month and then to Missouri to stand trial. "The girl," Marshal Bates said. "Miss Holloway, there is no real warrant on her, is there?" "No, sir," said Gideon. "The warrant Pratt was carrying was forged. He paid Brennan $400 for it." The marshal nodded slowly. "I will see that the false warrant is destroyed. I will also send a wire to St. Louis. There is some question about the true ownership of certain family assets that Cornelius Pratt has been administering. Miss Holloway may yet inherit something from her grandmother's estate. Hard to say." "It does not matter," said Ezra. "She is staying here. She is not going anywhere." The marshal smiled. He had a daughter Clara's age. He understood. "I figured as much," he said. 2 weeks later, on a clear afternoon in early October, Ezra Whitaker walked Clara to a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. His hand trembled on her arm. He had been out of bed for 10 days. He had walked half a mile that morning across the south pasture, but this small walk down the hallway was harder. He stood before the door. He laid his hand on the brass handle. "Will you come in with me?" he asked. She nodded. They opened the door together. Dust drifted in the yellow afternoon light. The room was small, a child's bed against one wall with a faded blue blanket folded at its foot, a wooden horse on the windowsill painted red and white, the paint cracked with age, a pair of small brown leather boots beside the bed no larger than the palm of a man's hand, a row of carved wooden animals on the dresser, a wool cap on a peg by the door. Ezra Whitaker walked to the center of the room. He looked at the wooden horse on the windowsill. He picked it up. He held it against his chest. He sat down on the edge of the small bed, and his shoulders began to shake, and Clara crossed the room and sat down beside him and put her arms around him. He cried for a long time. He cried in a way he had never cried before, not the silent, locked grief of a man holding himself together, the other kind, the kind that finally, after 2 years, allowed something to leave him. When he was done, he set the wooden horse gently in Clara's lap. "I want to put this on the bookshelf in the parlor," he said, "where everyone can see it. I want our children to know about him. He was a good boy. He laughed at everything. He would have loved you." Clara held the wooden horse in both hands and pressed it against her chest. "I will love him for you," she whispered. "I will tell our children stories about their older brother every night. He will not be forgotten, I promise you." That afternoon, Ezra and Gideon and Elias spent 4 hours sorting through the things in Asa's room and Eleanor's room. They did not throw anything away. They folded the small clothes carefully into a cedar trunk. They wrapped the toys in clean cloth. They placed the trunk in the attic where it would be kept always, but not as a tomb, as a memory. Eleanor's wedding gown they kept hanging in the wardrobe in what would become a guest room. Some things still belonged to her and would. The wooden horse went on the parlor bookshelf. Beside it in time would stand a second wooden horse, smaller and newer, painted blue and white. On the last Saturday of October, Ezra Whitaker brought Clara into the general store at Salvation Creek. His brothers walked in behind them. The store fell silent. Reverend Hobart was no longer in town.
He had left 10 days after the events on the mountain, citing a call from a congregation in Ohio. Doc Thorne had also packed up and gone to Laramie, or possibly farther. Sheriff Brennan was still wearing his star, but barely. His authority in town had drained away like water from a cracked pitcher. Ezra walked to the counter. He bought a 50-pound bag of flour. He bought a bolt of blue calico cloth for Clara, the kind she had once been mending shirts with at his kitchen table. He paid in silver. He turned to face the room. There must have been 30 people in the store, more on the boardwalk outside, staring through the windows. His voice carried easily across the silent room. "This woman," he said, "Clara Holloway, saved my life. Saved the life of Hank Bishop's son. Saved my best foal. She is going to be my wife. We will be married 3 weeks from today on the 15th of November at the ranch. All of you are invited. Every soul in this town is welcome at the wedding." He paused. He looked around. His amber eyes settled on each face in turn. "And if any one of you ever speaks an unkind word about her, or even thinks of giving her trouble in this town, you have trouble with the Whitaker family, all of us, every man on the ridge. Are we understood?" Gideon stepped up beside him. "And with me." Elias stepped up on the other side. "And with me." There was a long silence. Then a voice spoke from the back of the store. "Mr. Whitaker." It was Mrs. Hattie Pemberton. She was 70 years old. She had come west in the wagons of 1850. She had buried 2 husbands and 4 children on the trail and on the homestead. She was by long measure the most respected old woman in Salvation Creek. She walked slowly to the front of the store, leaning on her cane. She stood in front of Clara. She looked her up and down. "Miss Holloway," she said, "I will be at your wedding, and I will bring my apple pie. I have not made it for a wedding in 11 years. I am pleased to be making it for yours." She turned and walked back through the silent store. At the door she stopped. "And the rest of you," she said, addressing no one and everyone, "you will be at that wedding too. You will bring a covered dish, you will smile, and you will be glad that this family has had a piece of joy after the years they have had. Do I make myself plain?" The silence in the store changed shape. Then a man near the back, an old rancher named Whitcomb, took off his hat and held it against his chest, and he said quietly, "I will be there, Mr. Whitaker, mighty pleased to attend." Then the store was full of voices, apologies half-spoken, congratulations awkwardly given, an old woman hugging Clara, a man Clara had never seen before pressing a small jar of honey into her hands, a child bringing her a single late wildflower. Ezra Whitaker watched all of this with his hand resting on his wife's shoulder, and he thought of the road in the dust 6 months ago, and he thought of his grandmother's words, and he understood that the wheel of the world had turned, and the seasons had changed, and the long winter inside him had finally ended. The 15th of November was clear and cold. The first hard frost had come down from the peaks the night before, and the meadow grass crunched underfoot in the morning. By noon, the sun had warmed the sheltered side of the great oak that stood on the hill behind the main house, and there was no wind at all. Clara wore the white wedding dress. Martha had spent 2 weeks letting it out at the seams, pressing the cinnamon dust out of the hem, mending the small tears with invisible stitches. The bodice fit her exactly now. The skirt fell clean. Small, fresh wildflowers, the last of the season, were tucked into her honey-blonde hair. She carried a bouquet of white asters and dried lavender and sprigs of rosemary from her own garden. Ezra Whitaker stood beneath the oak in a black wool coat that had belonged to his father. His chestnut hair had been freshly cut. His face was clean-shaven for the first time in 2 years. His amber eyes were shining. Gideon Whitaker stood beside him as best man. He had cut his own hair the day before for the first time in 6 months, and he was wearing a white shirt with a stiff new collar that he kept tugging at uncomfortably. Elias Whitaker walked Clara up the long aisle through the assembled guests. Most of the town had come. Hattie Pemberton was in the front row in her best black dress. Hank and Esther Bishop sat together with Obadiah between them. The ranch hands stood in a respectful row at the back. Pete Hawkins from the saloon had brought a fiddle. The minister was a kindly old preacher from a small town 20 miles to the west, a circuit rider who had buried Eleanor and Asa 2 years earlier and who had agreed to come back today for happier work. When the time came for the vows, Ezra spoke first. "Clara, you did not just heal my fever. You healed the cold inside me. You gave me the first meal of a new life when I had decided to starve to death. I will repay you with every meal of every day for the rest of my life. I promise it. Before God, before these witnesses, before the people we have lost and the people who are still to come." Clara's eyes filled. "My grandmother," she said, "taught me that love is like a garden. You tend it every day in good weather and bad. You weed it, you water it. You do not abandon it when the season turns hard. I will tend the garden of our love every day of my life. I will tend it for you and for your brothers, and for the memory of Eleanor and Asa, who are part of this garden too. I will not let it die." She paused. She looked up at the great oak above them, which had once held the wedding of another bride. "I think she is here," she whispered. "I think she is glad." Elias, holding the ring, would later tell Gideon that he felt at that moment a sudden warmth at his shoulder, like a hand laid there in blessing, and when he turned his head, there was nothing, only the cold November air and the bare branches of the oak. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Pete Hawkins played his fiddle, and the people of Salvation Creek danced on the meadow grass, and Hattie Pemberton's apple pie was eaten down to the last crumb, and the long table set up under the oak held more covered dishes than 3 families could finish in a week. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was beginning to lower toward the western mountains, Ezra Whitaker took his bride by the hand and led her to a small bench at the edge of the meadow away from the celebration. He sat down. She sat beside him. He pulled her close against his shoulder. They watched the sun set together. The first night of their marriage was their own. The bedroom door closed softly behind them. The light from the oil lamp flickered against the curtains. Then the lamp was put out, and the night settled over Whitaker Ridge, and what passed between Ezra and Clara was theirs alone, fade to black. A year and a half later, Clara sat on the front porch of the main house with a small bundle in her arms. The bundle was a baby boy. His name was Tobias James Whitaker, named for Ezra's late grandfather, the man who had built this ranch with his bare hands 60 years before. The baby had honey blonde hair like his mother and amber eyes like his father, and the cornflower blue eyes of his great-great-grandmother Maeve had not appeared in him, but Clara expected them to appear in a daughter someday. She was patient. On the bookshelf in the parlor stood 2 wooden horses now. The old red and white one that had belonged to Asa, and a new blue and white one freshly carved by Elias over the long winter for Tobias. Hope the black filly Clara had saved on the night that started. Everything was now a strong yearling running in the high pasture. Her own first foal, a black colt named Resolute, ran beside her. Belle, the old mare with the bad leg, was retired now. She lived in a small paddock by the kitchen garden, where she could come and visit Clara every morning for an apple. The leg had never given her trouble again. Gideon Whitaker had married a young widow named Adelaide Whitcomb that same spring. She had come up the mountain to Whitaker Ridge with her 2 small children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. Gideon had become a father overnight, and the change in him was something his brothers could only marvel at. He laughed now. He had not laughed in years. His new son followed him everywhere with worshipful eyes, and Gideon, who had once tracked outlaws through the Powder River country, taught the boy to whittle a stick into the shape of a duck. Elias was still unmarried. He had a sweetheart in town, the daughter of the new doctor, a young woman with a bright mind and kind eyes. Things were unfolding slowly in the careful way of his nature. But he was happy. He spent his evenings now with a writing desk and a stack of paper working on a book he had been compiling for over a year. The book combined his veterinary training with Clara's grandmother's herbal notebook. They worked on it together, Clara dictating from the old pages and Elias translating the recipes into clean modern prose. The book would be called Mountain Medicine, the Wisdom of Mothers and Grandmothers on the Western Frontier. It would be published in Boston in 1882. It would still be in print 60 years later. On this particular afternoon in May, Clara sat on the porch with her baby in her arms and looked out across the valley. The grass was the pale green of new growth. The Indian paintbrush was just beginning to bloom on the south-facing slopes. The world against all odds had become beautiful again. Ezra Whitaker walked up from the corrals. He was 36 years old now. The hard set of his jaw had softened. The amber of his eyes had warmed. He carried a tin cup in his hand. He sat down beside her on the porch and pressed the cup of cold lemonade into her free hand. He kissed the top of her head. He kissed the soft curve of his son's forehead. "There is a letter from the marshal," he said quietly. "Cornelius Pratt died in the prison hospital last month. Pneumonia. Mortimer Grimes was hanged in Missouri before Christmas." Clara nodded slowly. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief exactly. She felt only the slow closing of a door that had been open in her chest for a long time. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He pulled her closer against his shoulder. The 3 of them sat in the warm afternoon light. In the distance, Hope was running in the high pasture with her own black filly at her side, the next generation of Thunder's line, and the wind brought the scent of mountain pine and lilac and turned earth. Ezra Whitaker lifted his eyes to the high mountain meadow above the ranch, where 2 small headstones stood beneath a fir tree. Eleanor Reeves Whitaker, Asa James Whitaker, beloved. And for the first time looking at those stones, he did not feel pain. He felt gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the wife of his youth in his heart, where she could hear him. "Thank you for sending her to me." The mountain wind picked up his words and carried them upward higher and higher into the bright spring sky. Tobias James Whitaker stirred against his mother's chest and made a small, soft sound. Clara smiled and rocked him. She bent her head to his and breathed in the warm, milky scent of his hair. "Do not worry, little one," she whispered. "In this house there will never be anyone hungry again." The sun moved slowly toward the western peaks. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Somewhere down at the corrals, Elias was singing. Somewhere out in the south pasture, Gideon was teaching his stepson to ride. Somewhere in the upstairs of the main house, Martha Hayes was humming an old Tennessee hymn while she folded clean baby clothes. The ranch was alive. The family was whole. The piece of bread that 3 weary men had once given to a dying stranger in the red dust of a Wyoming road had grown against all odds into a feast that would feed 3 generations. A debt, Clara had once said, is a debt. But this was not a debt anymore. This was love. This was home. This was the harvest of a long, hard season and the quiet promise of every sunrise still to come.